Final Fantasy VI. Talk about a monolith. Though it's certainly not perfect, I think I can say that Final Fantasy VI has been consistently my favorite game of all time for the longest time of any game that has ever held that position. That's a position that changes a lot, but Final Fantasy VI was my favorite game of all time for 5 years straight. There's so much depth to it, and so many odd quirks that make it unlike any other game I've ever played. It had a big impact on me in my formative years. But how do you even go about tackling such a behemoth of a game? What do you even start to say? I mean, aside from all the things I've already said about the game in various other videos, of course. Well, there is one scene that I think everybody knows. One scene that instantly screams Final Fantasy VI. It's a single night at the Opera House, down in Jidor. This scene is one of those special quirks that sets Final Fantasy VI apart from anything else I've ever played. There's just so much to go into with this one seemingly silly interaction. So, for starters, there's context to the scene, of course. I mean, there's about at least 10 hours of gameplay before it. One of your party members, former Imperial General Solis Cher, happens to look like a famous opera singer named Maria who always gets kidnapped by the world's only airship owner, Setzer Gabbiani. Since they need to get to the southern continent without Imperial interference, they decide to let Solis get kidnapped so they can stow away on board the airship in question. Locke, the treasure hunter and trail-worn traveler of the group, who can be more accurately described as a thief, has some objections due to his feelings for Solis, but the plan is initiated regardless. In some ways, this whole sequence is the biggest part of the romantic subplot of this game. Upon arriving at the Opera House, Solis will go and start to get ready to perform. The other characters note that she's a pretty terrible singer, and she magically gets better at it somehow before the play starts. Whatever, it's fine. It's a silly scene. Something I find way funnier is that if you hired Shadow before going to the Opera House, he will immediately leave your party upon entering because he hates the opera. Also incredibly comedic here is the reappearance of comedy villain and purple octopus extraordinaire, Ultros. The dastardly fiend drops a letter saying that he's going to infiltrate the opera, but none of the party members see it, which disappoints him greatly. The opera begins, and it's incredibly graphically impressive. There is a heavily detailed orchestra in the front, and Nobuo Uematsu's compositions are always spectacular. I think the team really realized that in this game, because this whole scenario feels like it was written to showcase his excellent score. It's this tragic opera about star-crossed lovers that plays out on stage in front of you. In a lot of ways, the events of the game are mirrored in this opera. An evil kingdom is occupying more and more smaller kingdoms, much like the Empire is doing. Solis's role as the female love interest in the play sort of shows her softer feelings that she has been developing for Locke, and they are similarly split due to a war going on. Solis, a former Imperial general, and Locke, a rebel scoundrel. Her formal loyalties to the Empire come into play as the main divide between the two. Something else interesting to note is that Final Fantasy VI itself is a huge love letter to the format of Italian opera, namely in its ensemble cast, heavy usage of character-centric leitmotif, and the roll call at the very end with quote-unquote actors. So this also feels fitting for that reason. There is so much to go into with this game. After watching this brief scene, you gain control of Locke and you can talk to your other party members who are also watching. Something I find particularly funny is that Sabin has no idea why everybody is singing. You'll get there, Sabin. I believe in you. Even Gao has more of an idea of what's going on than he does. Locke and Solis have a one-on-one moment before she goes on stage for her part that has some different connotations in it depending on which version of the game you're playing. The original English translation is a lot more subtle here, and I prefer it. As I've stated before, I don't hate the Game Boy Advance translation, I just think that both translations have things about them that are better than the other, to the point where neither is definitive, like some people make the Game Boy Advance one out to be. In fact, I much prefer the Game Boy Advance version's lyrics of Araya de Mezzocaratore, but we'll get into that segment shortly. I'd love to make a combined script someday that has what I like about both of them, but I don't really see that happening. Anyway, Locke and Solis talk about how he has feelings for her, and while in the original release he says, "I once abandoned someone when they needed me," in reference to Rachel, in the Game Boy Advance translation he says that he just can't stand by while the girls he likes get hurt. It's a very different, less subdued characterization of Locke that I'm not a fan of at all. I do like how when he's confronted with Solis dressed as an opera singer, he becomes speechless. That's really cute. You can read the score here, though if you're like me, you have both versions of the opera song memorized by heart, and you go out on stage as Celise. This part is really interesting, because you can actually fuck it up and get kicked out of the opera house and forced to try it again. Fun fact, there's a weird audio bug that occurs when this happens that I encountered in the SNES version that makes all the songs a higher pitch until you reset the console. I don't know why. Anyway, it's a pretty standard love song, but the choreography and the way she sings were so far beyond anything the SNES had seen for the time. It really is just watching an opera in a video game. I mean, it's still a warbly MIDI voice, but it feels like a performance. There's even a great bit of foreshadowing here. When she throws the bouquet of flowers off the side of the ramparts, it takes the arc of Celise's suicide attempt later in the game. And trust me, this scene is incredibly relevant to Celise as a character. Aria de Mezzo di Carattere is the first time we hear the melody that's later known as Celise's theme. That's the theme that plays when she attempts suicide, and it's the theme that plays throughout several scenes centering on her as a character. However, it's not revealed to us as Celise's theme. It's revealed to us as Aria de Mezzo di Carattere. Celise and the opera are intrinsically intertwined, whether Celise likes it or not. It's after this, and a song that feels incredibly inspired by I Know You from Sleeping Beauty, that Locke finally finds the letter from Ultros, and he goes with the rest of the party to stop Ultros from shoving a gigantic weight on top of Celise's head. While they're doing this, the play continues with an appropriate battle scene. The sequence of you chasing Ultros up into the rafters perfectly flows with the music the orchestra is performing for the scene as well. It's one of the few moments of diegetic music we get in the Final Fantasy series, and I think it's really cool. You can also fuck up the switches backstage and end up messing with the opera, which is pretty fun. To quote Ultros, the weight will take him exactly 5 minutes to push, so you have to make it there in a hurry. I really like that specific dialogue of him saying it will take him exactly 5 minutes to push. It's a really funny detail. Ultros in general just has great writing across the board. This leads to my only problem with this segment. There are a lot of rats in the rafters that can be difficult to clear out in the allotted time to get to Ultros, and it's really stressful. I understand that's probably part of the point, but it's still really frustrating in a way that most of Final Fantasy VI isn't, and it's kind of a weird difficulty jump. Rest assured, you shove him off, and not the weight, and everyone fights Ultros on stage and improvs it into the performance. Again, this scene is also scored diegetically. It's the only scene to use a certain battle theme, which is performed by the orchestra. This battle theme is used in no other battle in the game, and I love that. Something I find funny about this interaction is that Ultros acts as if he knows the party, and it's possible he does considering that Edgar and Sabin were 2 of the 4 people who met him before. However, you can bring a full party of people who have never met him, which makes these comments completely baffling. He probably read about them or something. He also claims to be Octopus royalty. I really like Ultros' inclusion here. It's his first reappearance after his first battle, and it's where he's really cemented as the comedic jester villain he is. He's silly and fun, and he really fits the whole vibe of this sort of side adventure. After defeating Ultros, Celise gets kidnapped by Setzer in his daring second act ending escape scene, and that's the end of the Opera House. I mean, there's an optional boss fight with the Earth Dragon here in the World of Ruin, but really, who gives a shit about that? When discussing the Opera House from Final Fantasy VI, that's not what people want to hear about. They want to hear about the emotions the scene made them feel when they first played it. I know a guy who cries every time he hears the song from this scene. When I first played this scene, even though I grew up in an age where graphics for scenes like this had long surpassed the original, I got goosebumps because of how grandiose it feels. It really pulls you into the narrative of the Opera House. It really feels like you're watching and participating in a live show. To date, I haven't ever had a game come close to that when it comes to emulating the feeling of watching a live performance. Uematsu really sells it with the score. Not only that, none of it really feels like a waste of your time. There are a lot of games where something like this would feel like a major distraction from the main plot and a pace breaker, but here you're just having some fun and downtime directly on the way to saving the world. It's a nice distraction, an excuse for the characters to just hang out. I wish we had some conversations between the party while waiting for the show to start or something, though obviously it would be difficult to come up with a unique conversation for every possible permutation of party members that you could bring. I think it would be worth the effort. After all, what is Final Fantasy VI if not an ensemble? To top it all off, what is Final Fantasy VI if not the opera? This has been Arcade Everlasting, the darkness and you the starlight. Signing off. Thank you for watching.